The last negotiation. The Galactic Council's Grand Chamber was silent. Hundreds of alien diplomats, generals and rulers sat in a circular formation, their eyes fixed on a single figure standing in the center, Ambassador Elias Carter, humanity's representative. The Council had gathered for one final negotiation with Earth. The terms were simple: submit to the authority of the Galactic Empire, or face the consequences. A tall, reptilian alien known as High Chancellor Vecthar stood up, his deep voice echoing across the room. "Human Ambassador, this is your last chance. Accept the treaty, and Earth will be spared." Elias didn't flinch. He had seen this tactic before. An offer disguised as mercy, but in reality, it was submission. The Galactic Empire had already conquered hundreds of planets, absorbing their cultures and stripping them of independence. He slowly adjusted his suit and looked at the council members one by one. "Spared from what?" Elias finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Vecthar's expression darkened. "From total annihilation. Our fleets outnumber yours 1,000 to 1. If you reject our offer, humanity will not survive." Murmurs spread through the chamber. Some alien factions, like the peaceful Zorans, looked uneasy. Others, like the war-hungry Kragnors, grinned at the thought of Earth's destruction. Elias let a brief silence settle before he spoke again. "You think we fear you." He stepped forward, his voice growing stronger. "You have underestimated humanity from the beginning. We are not weak. We are not afraid. And we will never bow to tyrants." Gasps filled the chamber. Some council members exchanged worried glances. The Galactic Empire was used to fear and obedience, but humans were different. Vecthar's expression twisted in anger. "Then you leave us no choice. Earth will burn for its defiance." Elias gave a small, knowing smile. "We expected this response, which is why, even as we speak, Earth's war fleet is mobilizing." The council chamber erupted in chaos. Some leaders shouted in disbelief, others demanded explanations. No one had ever challenged the Galactic Empire like this before. Vecthar slammed his fist on the table. "You will regret this, human." Elias turned and walked away. As he reached the exit, he gave one final statement. "No, Chancellor. You will." The doors closed behind him. The war had begun. Outside the Galactic Council's chamber, Elias Carter could hear the faint sounds of hurried footsteps and murmurs. The atmosphere in the corridors of the Empire's grand ship was tense, filled with uncertainty. But Elias was unshaken. The Council's threat was clear, but he knew that humanity wasn't going to cower. As he passed a group of human officers, he gave them a reassuring nod. The strength in their eyes reflected the same resolve he carried. They knew what this meant. Earth had rejected the Council's offer of submission, and now, the fate of humanity rested on their shoulders. Elias reached the communications hub, where he was met by General Riley, an experienced officer who had fought in multiple interstellar skirmishes. She wasted no time. "Ambassador, the fleet is ready. We've confirmed the departure of all warships. The first wave will be in position within hours." Elias nodded. "Good. No hesitation. We need to show the galaxy that we will not back down." Riley's eyes gleamed with determination. "We'll give them a fight they'll never forget." The decision was made. Earth's fleet had been assembling for weeks in secret, hidden from the prying eyes of the Empire. Elias and his team had spent countless hours preparing humanity's defense, creating strategies, bolstering the fleet, and ensuring that Earth's forces would be ready for the inevitable confrontation. As Elias watched the fleet preparations unfold, he thought of the lives that would be put at risk, the families that would lose loved ones. But he knew there was no turning back now. The alternative, surrender, was far worse. Humanity would stand its ground. The first of Earth's warships, sleek and powerful, slipped into the vast expanse of space. The fleet was unlike anything the Galactic Empire had ever seen. A fusion of human ingenuity and cutting-edge technology, Each vessel was equipped with advanced weaponry and defenses that made them a formidable force. "Ready the communications. It's time to send a message," Elias ordered. Riley quickly relayed the order, and a transmission was sent to the Galactic Empire's War Command. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of defiance. Humanity does not negotiate with tyrants. Prepare for the consequences of your actions. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, a cold, distorted voice responded. "You are making a grave mistake. You will regret this." Elias's eyes narrowed. "We shall see," he muttered. He turned to Riley. "Deploy the fleet. Let's show them what humanity is capable of." The countdown began. The massive fleet of human warships, accompanied by thousands of support vessels, shifted into formation. The goal was clear. They would make their stand against the Empire's overwhelming force. It was a gamble, one that could either end in humanity's destruction or its greatest victory. The tension was palpable as the fleet moved toward its destination, deep within the Empire's controlled space. Every ship, every soldier aboard knew that this could be their final battle. But they were ready. Elias stood on the bridge of his command ship, his gaze fixed on the fleet as it advanced into the vast, starry expanse. The hum of the engines was the only sound, but Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that this would be no ordinary battle. "For Earth," he whispered to himself. With a final glance at the fleet, Elias gave the signal. "Engage." In an instant, humanity's warships fired their first volley, and the universe would never be the same again. The moment the first volley of energy bolts erupted from Earth's warships, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The blinding light from the weapons illuminated the dark void of space, marking the beginning of what would become a legendary battle. The Galactic Empire, which had once looked down upon humanity, now found itself facing a force unlike anything it had anticipated. Elias stood at the center of the command bridge, his hands clenched into fists. The power of humanity's fleet, which had once been dismissed as insignificant, was now unleashed upon the Empire. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him. This moment would either make or break humanity's place in the galaxy. "Sir, the enemy fleet is coming into view." General Riley's voice broke through the tension in the air. Her expression was calm, but Elias knew she was just as focused as he was. "Understood. All ships, maintain position and prepare for the next wave," Elias ordered, his voice steady, but his heart raced in his chest. On the view screen, a massive fleet of Galactic Empire warships materialized in the distance, their dark hulls gleaming under the cold light of distant stars. It was an overwhelming sight. The Empire had an army of untold numbers, each ship brimming with the power to wipe out entire civilizations. Yet, as Elias looked upon them, he saw nothing but an opportunity. "We will not back down," Elias muttered under his breath. "Not now. Not ever." He knew that this was the first of many battles, but Earth's fleet wasn't going to wait. Humanity had chosen to act, to fight back against the very empire that had once ruled with an iron fist. The time for negotiations had passed. It was now a matter of survival. On the other side of the battlefield, the Galactic Empire's fleet was mobilizing. The once imposing force, which had crushed countless civilizations, was now facing an enemy they had underestimated. "Their ships are firing. Return fire immediately," one of the officers on the bridge shouted. Riley barked the orders to the crew, and in an instant, the battle escalated. Human ships fired back with precision, their weaponry designed to counter the Empire's technological superiority. A massive beam of energy shot forth, striking the lead Empire warship and sending it into a rapid spin. The blast rocked the fleet, sending a ripple of shock through their ranks. "Direct hit. They're breaking formation," one of the officers reported. Elias couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Earth had delivered the first blow, and it was powerful enough to make even the most seasoned Imperial commanders rethink their tactics. but there was no time to rest on their laurels. The battle was far from over. As the human fleet continued to fire, the Empire's ships retaliated. Laser beams and plasma bolts filled the space between them, creating a dazzling light show of destruction. Explosions rocked the battlefield, but Earth's warships held firm, their shields glowing as they absorbed the barrage. Each ship moved with deadly precision, firing off volleys of energy weapons while simultaneously dodging incoming fire. "Sir, enemy ships are attempting to surround us," another officer reported. Elias's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated this. The Empire had more numbers, and they would try to use their superior firepower to overwhelm them. But he had a plan. "All ships, shift formations. Flank them from the sides," Elias ordered. "We need to spread their fire and make them waste their shots." Humanity's fleet responded with practiced coordination, breaking their tight formations and spreading out across the battlefield. The Empire's ships followed, but it was clear that the Empire's fleet wasn't used to this kind of unpredictability. They were used to crushing their enemies with sheer numbers, but humanity's warships were nimble, and they knew how to fight smart. "They're adapting," Riley said, her voice tinged with excitement. "They didn't expect us to be this agile." The battle raged on, and with every passing minute, the human fleet's resolve grew stronger. Elias could feel the tension mounting. Every decision was a matter of life or death. Every command had to be precise, but he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. "We can do this," Elias whispered under his breath. "We're fighting for more than just our survival. We're fighting for everything." As the human fleet continued to press forward, the Empire's forces began to falter. Their ships, while numerous, couldn't seem to match the relentless precision and unpredictability of Earth's forces. One by one, Imperial ships began to fall. Some were destroyed outright, while others were forced to retreat. But Elias knew this was only the beginning. The Empire wouldn't go down without a fight. They would send in reinforcements. They would try to break the human will. But for now, humanity had the upper hand. And in this moment, Earth's fleet proved that they were no longer the insignificant species the galaxy had once dismissed. They were powerful, they were ready, and they would make the Empire regret ever underestimating them. The battle wasn't over yet, but the galaxy had been warned. Humanity was not to be trifled with. The silence that followed the battle was eerie. The once glorious fleet of the Galactic Empire now drifted in space, broken and scattered. Fires raged within the wreckage of fallen ships, and escape pods floated aimlessly, their occupants still in shock. Humanity had won the first round. But Elias knew this was just the beginning. On the command deck of the Horizon, the flagship of Earth's fleet, Elias stood with his arms crossed, watching the reports come in. "We lost 6 ships, General Riley said, scanning the battle logs. But the Empire lost nearly 30. Elias nodded, but there was no time for celebration. The Empire had ruled the galaxy for centuries, crushing rebellions without mercy. A single defeat wouldn't make them surrender. If anything, it would make them furious. "Sir, we have intercepted a transmission from the Empire," one of the communication officers reported. "It's being broadcasted across the entire sector." Elias turned to the main screen where a figure appeared. Acceleron Commander, his reptilian features twisted in anger. His golden armor bore the insignia of the Imperial fleet, and his crimson eyes burned with rage. "Humans," the commander snarled. "You dare defy the will of the Empire. You will burn for your arrogance." The transmission flickered, revealing massive reinforcements. Hundreds of Imperial warships were now moving toward Earth's position. "They're bringing everything they have," Riley whispered, her hands tightening into fists. Elias took a deep breath. This was what he had expected. The Empire wouldn't tolerate humiliation. They would return with overwhelming force. "How long until they reach us?" Elias asked. "Less than an hour," the officer responded grimly. "They outnumber us 10 to 1. The crew exchanged nervous glances. The first battle had been a tactical victory, but now the full might of the Empire was coming. The numbers were impossible to ignore. "They think numbers will be enough to crush us," Elias said, stepping forward. "They think fear will break us, but they don't understand what humanity is capable of." His voice carried across the bridge, steady and unshaken. "Prepare all ships. We're not running. We're not surrendering. We fight." Riley grinned. "Yes, sir." As alarms blared across the fleet, humanity prepared for the biggest battle in its history. The final test had begun. The war alarms echoed through every human ship, a grim reminder of the battle that was about to unfold. Across the fleet, soldiers armed themselves, pilots strapped into their fighters, and engineers made last-minute adjustments to the ship's defenses. The Galactic Empire was coming in full force, and this time, they would not hold back. Elias stood in the command center of the horizon, staring at the holographic display. Hundreds of enemy warships were moving fast, their formation designed for one thing: total annihilation. "Status report," he commanded. General Riley, standing beside him, studied the data. "Enemy fleet is in attack formation. Their capital ships are staying behind, while the smaller destroyers move in first. They're trying to weaken us before delivering the final blow." Elias smirked. "Good. That means they think we'll just stand here and take the hit." The humans had fought wars before, but this wasn't just another battle. This was survival. The Empire wanted them gone, erased from history like so many others. But humanity wasn't like the others. "All ships, defensive positions," Elias ordered. "Let them come." The vast darkness of space was soon illuminated by streaks of light as the Imperial fleet opened fire. Plasma bolts the size of buildings tore through space, seeking their targets. Human ships weaved through the chaos, dodging and counterattacking with precise, deadly force. The first wave of Imperial destroyers rushed in, expecting an easy victory. They were met with a storm of human firepower. Earth's warships, smaller but far more maneuverable, danced between the enemy lines, targeting weak points with deadly accuracy. "Enemy destroyers are breaking apart," an officer called out. "Their formation is collapsing." Elias watched as explosions erupted across the battlefield, but he knew this was only the beginning. The real threat was still coming. Suddenly, the Imperial capital ships moved into position. These were the behemoths of war, armed with weapons powerful enough to destroy entire fleets with a single shot. And they were all locked onto the horizon. "They're targeting us, sir," Riley shouted. Elias gritted his teeth. He had expected this. The Empire wanted to cut off the head of the resistance, believing that if they took out the flagship, the rest of the fleet would fall apart. "All power to shields," Elias commanded. "We hold the line." The first shot came like a falling star, blazing through space. The horizon shook violently as the impact sent ripples through its hull. Warning alarms blared, and sparks flew from the control panels. "Shields at 60%. An officer called out. "We can't take another hit like that." Elias clenched his fists. They were running out of time. Then an idea struck him, a dangerous, reckless idea. "Divert all remaining energy to the main rail cannons," he ordered. "Target their capital ship's command deck." Riley's eyes widened. "Sir, if we do that, our shields will drop completely." Elias stared at the battlefield. "Then we don't get hit." The crew hesitated for only a second before following his orders. Power was rerouted, and the ship's main weapons charged up. The Empire's capital ship prepared for another devastating shot. But this time, the horizon fired first. A blinding streak of energy tore through space, striking the Imperial flagship right in the command center. The explosion was instant. The enemy's most powerful warship erupted into flames, its debris scattering in all directions. A moment of silence passed. Then, panic spread through the enemy fleet. "Their flagship is down," Riley gasped. "They're retreating." Elias exhaled, watching as the once invincible galactic empire now fled in fear. But he knew this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The battle had turned in humanity's favor, but the cost had been enormous. The horizon was battered, its hull pockmarked with blast marks from the Imperial weapons. The engines were running at less than half capacity, and its shields were nearly gone. But Elias knew that they couldn't stop now. The Empire's retreat was only temporary. They would regroup and return in full force. The battle was far from over. Inside the command center, Elias paced back and forth, his eyes fixed on the battlefield. On the holographic display, the remaining enemy ships were trying to reorganize, but the damage was clear. The Empire had lost its flagship, the heart of its fleet, and its soldiers were starting to panic. "We've got them on the ropes, Elias," General Riley said, his voice tense but hopeful. "Now we finish it." Elias shook his head. "They're not finished. Not yet. We need to buy time for the rest of the fleet to regroup. If we push too hard, we risk them calling in reinforcements." Riley frowned. "But if we don't act now, we could lose everything we've gained." Elias knew Riley was right. Every decision from here on out would determine the future of the human race. But Elias had learned a long time ago that human ingenuity was their greatest weapon, and he wasn't about to let the Empire use that to their advantage. "Let's give them a taste of their own medicine," Elias said. "Prepare the decoy ships. I want them to think we've got more reinforcements than we really do." Riley raised an eyebrow. "A bluff? Are you sure about this, sir?" "It's not a bluff if we can make it work." Elias's voice was steady. "We're going to give them a distraction they'll never forget." The decoy ships were equipped with advanced holographic projectors and false signature emitters, designed to mimic the power of an entire fleet. When deployed properly, they could convince the enemy that they were facing overwhelming numbers. As the decoys moved into position, Elias watched the enemy's movements carefully. The Imperial fleet, disoriented and unsure of how to respond, hesitated. The horizon and the remaining human ships moved into position, ready to strike. Then, the first wave of decoys was launched. A dazzling array of fake warships appeared on the enemy sensors, their signatures nearly identical to those of the human fleet. The Empire's commanders, desperate to regain control, ordered their ships to engage the decoys. As the decoy ships drifted toward the Imperial forces, Elias and Riley exchanged a brief glance. "Now we hit them where it hurts," Elias muttered. The remaining human ships turned their weapons on the confused Imperial fleet, taking advantage of the chaos the decoys had caused. One by one, the Empire's ships began to fall. The Imperial soldiers, caught off guard by the sudden counterattack, struggled to maintain their position. But even as the tide seemed to turn, a new danger appeared. A massive reinforcements fleet appeared on the edge of the battlefield. Too late to save the Empire's fleet, but enough to tip the scales in their favor once more. "Reinforcements are here," Riley said, his voice grim. "It's a full fleet. We can't fight this many." Elias's heart sank. The odds were stacking against them, and he knew the next move would be critical. If they didn't act fast, humanity would lose their edge, and the Empire would reclaim its strength. "All ships, prepare to form a defensive perimeter around the horizon." "We can't let them get any closer," Elias barked. He watched as the human fleet began to assemble, the remaining ships forming a tight ring of protection. The incoming enemy fleet closed in quickly, its numbers overwhelming. The weapons fire resumed, but now the humans were ready. They had learned from every battle and had adapted. Even against the Empire's reinforcements, they held their ground. But Elias knew they couldn't hold forever. His mind raced. There had to be a way out of this, a final gambit that could save humanity. As the battle raged on, Elias turned to his crew, his eyes full of determination. "We have one shot at this," he said, his voice unwavering. "Prepare the last-ditch assault." The crew knew what that meant, a full offensive, all or nothing. They would strike with everything they had left. One final push. It would either end the battle or ensure humanity's defeat. As the human fleet prepared for its final stand, Elias stood firm, knowing that this battle would be written into history, and whatever the outcome, humanity's courage would never be forgotten. The fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders. The battlefield was chaos. Explosions lit up the darkness of space as human warships clashed with the massive Imperial reinforcements. The Horizon led the charge, its weapons firing relentlessly, but Elias knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The enemy had sheer numbers on their side. Wave after wave of Imperial ships pressed forward, their weapons battering the last remnants of humanity's fleet. Shields flickered, engines sputtered, and hulls cracked under the relentless assault. "We can't keep this up," Riley shouted over the alarms blaring through the command center. "We're outgunned and outnumbered. If we don't pull back now." Elias slammed his fist against the console. "There's nowhere left to run, Riley. We either win here or we die." A tense silence filled the room. Everyone understood what was at stake. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was survival. If humanity lost here, there would be no second chance. Then, a new voice crackled through the comms. "Commander Elias, this is Admiral Hawthorne of the 2nd Human Fleet. We heard you could use some backup." Elias's eyes widened. "Repeat that, Admiral." Outside, space rippled as dozens, no, hundreds, of human warships emerged from hyperspace. The 2nd Human Fleet, hidden until now, had arrived. The reinforcements weren't for the Empire. They were for Earth. "Let's turn the tide," Hawthorne said. "All ships, open fire." The battlefield shifted in an instant. The new human fleet unleashed a devastating assault, catching the Empire completely off guard. Their once overwhelming numbers now seemed fragile, their formations breaking under the sudden counterattack. The Horizon surged forward, leading the charge. Fighters weaved between capital ships, blasting enemy engines and targeting weak spots. The Imperial forces, so confident in their victory, now found themselves in retreat. The tide had turned. Elias watched as one of the Imperial dreadnoughts, a massive behemoth that had dominated the battlefield, exploded in a fiery eruption. One by one, the enemy's warships fell, their fleet crumbling under the relentless human assault. The enemy's flagship, the Dominator, attempted to flee, its engines burning hot as it tried to escape the battle. "Not this time," Elias muttered. "All ships, target the Dominator's engines. Don't let them run." Torpedoes and energy beams struck the Imperial flagship, tearing through its armor. A final missile barrage struck its core, and in a blinding explosion, the Dominator was gone. And with it, the Empire's last hope of victory. What remained of the Imperial fleet scattered, some ships surrendering, others fleeing into deep space. The once mighty Armada had been crushed. Humanity had won. A deafening cheer erupted across the fleet. Crews embraced, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Against impossible odds, they had done the unthinkable. Elias took a deep breath, staring out at the battlefield. Wreckage floated in the void, the remnants of a war that had nearly destroyed them all. "This isn't just a victory," he said quietly. "This is a warning." The Empire had learned the hard way that humanity wasn't weak. They weren't insignificant, and they would never kneel. This was just the beginning. The galaxy would never underestimate humanity again. The forgotten myth. The world was peaceful, almost too peaceful. People went about their daily lives, absorbed in their work, their routines, and the chaos of the modern world. They had forgotten the old stories, the ancient myths of powerful beings who had once walked the earth, protectors of humanity in times long past. These gods, as they were called, had once been the guardians of humankind, standing tall against any threat, no matter how powerful. But that was a time so far away, a time forgotten by most. It wasn't just a matter of history or tales passed down through generations. No, these gods were real as the mountains and oceans, as real as the sun that rose each morning. But over the centuries, their story had been buried beneath layers of time. Now, no one believed in them. Not really. They were just stories, whispered by the old and ignored by the young. The world had moved on, and the gods were forgotten, sleeping beneath the earth, their power dormant. However, deep within the earth, something stirred. A faint tremor rippled through the ground, barely noticeable to those who walked above. But to those who knew how to listen, it was the first sign of something awakening. For those who still remembered the old stories, it was a warning. Something was changing. Something ancient was beginning to rise again. Dr. Elena Rivera was one of those few who still believed in the old myths, though she had always thought of them as just that, myths. A scientist by trade, Elena's work focused on seismology. She studied the movements of the earth, the small tremors that went unnoticed by most. But there was something strange happening. The patterns were becoming more frequent, more intense, and they didn't fit the usual models. At first, she thought it was just a glitch, a minor anomaly in the data. But the more she looked, the more she realized that something was different. Elena wasn't the only one noticing these strange events. Around the world, there were others who had begun to sense something too. Strange dreams haunted those who were sensitive to the ancient energies, visions of battle and power, of gods standing tall against the forces of darkness. People who had no reason to be involved in these matters were beginning to experience these signs. And it was not just the dreams. Strange symbols began to appear, etched into the earth in remote places, appearing overnight. They were symbols that no one could understand, but those who had studied the old texts recognized them immediately. One of those was Professor Armitage, an expert in ancient languages. He had spent his life studying texts that many considered useless, from forgotten civilizations. When the symbols first appeared, he knew it wasn't a coincidence. He knew, in his bones, that the gods of old were real, and they were returning. The signs were clear. The question was, would humanity be ready for them? The government took notice as well, but not in the way one might hope. Instead of listening to the warnings of scientists and scholars, they'd brushed off the strange events as coincidences, nothing more than a product of overactive imaginations. But deep down, Elena and Armitage both knew the truth. The gods were waking up, and it wasn't going to be easy for anyone. As the days passed, the tremors grew stronger, and the strange symbols spread further across the globe. Some believed they were just an odd natural occurrence, a series of random events that would eventually fade away. But others, like Elena and Armitage, knew that this was the beginning of something far more dangerous. They knew that these gods, these ancient beings, were not like any humans had ever encountered before. They had been built for war, created to protect humanity from threats too powerful for ordinary people to handle. But their power came at a cost. They were warriors, and their rage was uncontrollable. The signs were now undeniable. The earth was reacting to something ancient, something buried deep within its core. But what exactly? No one could say for certain. The myths spoke of gods who had been forgotten for a reason, because their power was too great to be controlled. And as the first of the signs appeared, Elena couldn't help but wonder, was humanity ready to face them? Were they prepared for the return of the war gods? No one knew yet, but one thing was clear. The world was about to change. The old myth was coming to life, and nothing would be the same again. The tremors had become more than just strange patterns on a seismograph. Now, they were undeniable. The ground itself seemed to hum with a strange energy, a low vibration that echoed in the bones of those sensitive enough to feel it. People all over the world started to notice. Small earthquakes, odd shifts in the Earth's surface, and strange noises in the dead of night became more frequent. But it wasn't just the physical signs that worried those like Dr. Elena Rivera and Professor Armitage. It was what these events represented. Elena spent every waking moment in her lab, running test after test. She analyzed the tremors, studied the symbols that were appearing around the world, and tried to make sense of the patterns. But no matter how much data she gathered, The answer always came back to one thing. Something was awakening. But what? Her first real clue came when she found a pattern in the way the tremors moved. They weren't random. There was a rhythm, a structure to them, as if the earth itself was communicating, sending out signals in a coded language. And from that language, Alina realized that these weren't just random geological events. The symbols that had been appearing weren't just drawings. They were instructions. Instructions that led to one terrifying truth. The gods were coming back, and when they arrived, they would not come quietly. Far across the ocean, Professor Armitage was racing through ancient texts in his small, cluttered office. He had spent decades studying old civilizations, the ones that had vanished without a trace. But now, those ancient ruins seemed to speak to him more clearly than ever. He had discovered something he had never considered before. The war gods were not just legends. They were bound to the earth, dormant, waiting for a trigger to unleash them. The trigger, it seemed, had been pulled. The first true sign of the gods' return came late one night, when a massive tremor shook the entire city of New York. Buildings cracked, roads buckled, and the ground split open in an explosion of dust and debris. People screamed as they ran into the streets, but they couldn't escape the power of the earth. The ground seemed to breathe, like something alive. The sky above them flickered with strange lights, flashes of energy that made the air hum with a strange power. It was as if the earth itself was coming to life. Alina watched from her office as the city trembled. She felt the vibrations in her own bones, a deep thrum that seemed to resonate with the ancient pulse of the planet. She could see the lights flickering in the sky, and the images of the symbols that had been spreading across the world danced in her mind. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a witness to something that no one had dared imagine. The war gods were waking up, and there was no stopping them now. As the tremor subsided, the sky cleared, but the city was forever changed. Buildings were damaged, streets cracked, and cars were overturned. But the worst part wasn't the destruction. It was the feeling that hung in the air. A sense of dread, as if the very earth was preparing for something immense, something beyond human understanding. In the weeks that followed, the tremors continued, and they grew stronger. What was once a faint rumble had turned into violent shakes that rattled cities to their core. Earthquakes, storms, and strange weather patterns swept across the globe. The world was on edge. Governments scrambled to respond, but no one knew how to handle it. No one understood what was happening or what had triggered the events. But there were a few who did. Alina and Armitage, now working together, began to piece together the truth. The war gods were ancient beings who had once been part of the earth itself. They had been created to protect humanity from threats far beyond anything human forces could face. But over time, they had been forgotten, their powers sealed deep within the earth, waiting for the day when they would be needed again. But now that day had come. As the world spiraled into confusion, Alina found herself standing on the edge of a precipice. The war gods were awakening, and there was no going back. The ancient protectors of Earth had been locked away for centuries, but now their rage, their fury was beginning to rise. And when it came, it would not be peaceful. The gods were not gentle beings. They were warriors, created for war, for battle, and they had not forgotten their purpose. But even more terrifying than their return was the thought of what would happen if they were unleashed. Humanity had forgotten the power of these gods, but the gods had not forgotten humanity, and they would not forgive. As Alina stood in the quiet of her lab, she felt the ground rumble beneath her feet once again. The gods were awakening, and their time was now. The earth was not ready. Humanity was not ready. But the gods had waited long enough. The world was gripped by an unsettling silence. News outlets were filled with reports of earthquakes, strange weather patterns, and mysterious lights in the sky. Cities across the globe had been shaken, but nothing could explain the pattern of destruction. Governments were scrambling to maintain control, but every day brought more chaos. Alina and Armitage were working tirelessly, but each discovery only deepened the mystery. The tremors had grown more intense, no longer limited to a single region, but stretching across entire continents. It was as if the Earth itself was fighting against something hidden beneath the surface. Alina's research had led her to a shocking conclusion. The tremors weren't just random. They were deliberate. Something, or someone, was trying to break free from its prison. Armitage had uncovered an ancient prophecy buried in the ruins of an old civilization, a civilization that had vanished without a trace. The text spoke of a time when the earth would tremble and the gods would rise again. It described the gods as mighty warriors, protectors of humanity, but also bearers of immense power. And when they awoke, they would be unstoppable. The ancient texts hinted at a forgotten ritual, a forgotten time when the gods had walked among humans, their power unmatched. The gods had been sealed away, their fury contained within the core of the planet. But now, something had triggered their return. The tremors were only the beginning. Alina was convinced that the awakening of the war gods was no accident. The signs were clear. The gods were being drawn back into the world by some unknown force. But who or what was behind it? And what did the gods want from humanity? As she sat in her lab, the ground suddenly shook again, this time stronger than ever before. A loud crack echoed through the city, followed by a series of explosions. The buildings around her trembled, windows shattered, and dust filled the air. Alina rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw made her blood run cold. In the distance, a massive cloud of smoke and dust rose into the sky. The city seemed to tremble even more violently, as if something ancient and powerful had just been unleashed. Alina's hands shook as she pulled up her research data, trying to make sense of the new developments. The tremors weren't just random anymore. They were coordinated, precise. The war gods were coming. Across the world, similar events were unfolding. Reports of strange lights in the sky, sudden power outages, and unusual activity near ancient ruins flooded the news. People were terrified, but no one could explain what was happening. Governments were powerless to stop the destruction, and there was no clear plan for how to deal with it. The gods, once thought to be nothing more than myth, were now an undeniable reality. Alina and Armitage knew that humanity was facing a threat unlike anything it had ever known. These gods were not the benevolent protectors that ancient texts had suggested. No, these gods were warriors, born from the very heart of the earth, and they were coming with a fury that had been waiting centuries to be unleashed. But what did they want? Alina couldn't shake the feeling that the gods weren't just angry. They were looking for something, perhaps a long-lost enemy, or perhaps something even more dangerous than humanity could imagine. Whatever it was, the gods would not stop until they had it. As the days passed, Alina and Armitage raced against time, trying to uncover more information about the gods' return. They studied the ancient texts, pieced together the forgotten prophecies, and tried to understand the purpose of the gods' awakening. But each new discovery only led to more questions. The truth was becoming more elusive by the hour. And then, one fateful evening, Alina received a message that would change everything. A small encrypted file arrived on her computer. The source was unknown, but the contents were unmistakable. Coordinates, a location deep within the earth, far beneath the surface where the gods were believed to be sealed. The message was simple, yet chilling. The gods are waking. You cannot stop them. Prepare. Alina's heart raced as she stared at the screen. This was it. The moment of truth had arrived. The gods were about to rise, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. The world would never be the same again. The awakening had begun. The air was thick with tension as the world prepared for the unimaginable. Alina and Armitage knew that the coordinates they had received pointed to something monumental, but neither of them were prepared for what they would find. The war gods were no longer a distant myth. They were real, and they were coming for humanity. The tremors had grown more intense, not just in the regions surrounding the coordinates, but across the globe. It felt as though the earth itself was shaking with anticipation. Every minute, The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the ancient gods would emerge from their centuries-long slumber. Elena stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching as the sky flickered with strange lights. Reports of massive energy surges and unnatural phenomena were flooding in from all corners of the world. Governments were scrambling to respond, but their forces were powerless against the growing chaos. The gods had awakened, and nothing could stand in their way. At the coordinates, deep underground, a massive structure was beginning to stir. It was ancient, its design alien to anything humanity had ever seen. As Elena and Armitage made their way to the site, they could feel the ground vibrate beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was alive. They had reached the location, a forgotten cavern beneath a mountain range. The entrance was hidden, buried beneath layers of rock and earth. But even before they found the entrance, they could hear it, the distant sound of something heavy, something powerful, moving beneath the surface. Elena's heart pounded as she approached the cavern. She could feel the raw power emanating from it. This wasn't just a forgotten temple or an ancient ruin. This was something much older, something far more dangerous. "Are you ready for this?" Armitage asked, his voice low and serious. There was no humor in his tone, only the weight of the gravity that was sinking in. This was no longer a research mission. This was humanity's last hope, or its final destruction. Elena nodded, her mind racing with thoughts of the ancient prophecy. The gods had once been protectors, warriors who fought to defend the earth, but that was a long time ago. The prophecy also spoke of their fury, their anger when they were betrayed and sealed away. She feared that fury would now be directed at humanity. As they ventured deeper into the cavern, the air grew colder. The walls were covered in ancient symbols, carvings that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. It was as if the gods were watching them, waiting for them to reach the heart of their prison. Then they reached it, a massive door, crafted from a material unlike anything Elena had ever seen. The door was sealed shut, but cracks of light leaked through, glowing with an unnatural energy. The gods were awakening, and the door was their prison, their final barrier before they would be unleashed upon the world. Elena's mind was racing. She had studied every ancient text, every myth, every prophecy. But none of them had prepared her for this moment. The gods weren't just coming. They were already here, and their power was immense. As she reached out to touch the door, she felt a shock of energy surge through her fingertips. It was like nothing she had ever experienced, raw, ancient, and terrifyingly powerful. "We need to get out of here," Armitage said, his voice urgent. "Whatever is on the other side of this door, it's not something we can handle." But Elena stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the door. The energy was calling to her, pulling her closer. She knew that opening this door would change everything. It would either save humanity or doom it forever. But it wasn't just about humanity anymore. The gods were awakening, and their wrath was inevitable. With a final breath, Elena pressed her hand against the door, and the energy surged through her, filling her with a sense of power she had never known. The door groaned, and slowly it began to open. What lay beyond the door was unlike anything they had ever imagined. A blinding light flooded the cavern, and for a moment, everything went silent. Elena and Armitage stood at the threshold, eyes wide, as they beheld the gods. They were towering figures, their bodies made of solid stone and crackling with raw energy. Their eyes were glowing, filled with an ancient primal rage. The gods had been sealed away for centuries, but now they were free. And they were not happy. The ground trembled as the gods stepped forward, their massive forms shaking the cavern to its core. Elena felt the weight of their power pressing down on her, almost suffocating. These were no benevolent protectors. They were war gods, and they had been waiting for this moment to unleash their fury. The first god spoke, its voice like thunder, echoing through the cavern. "Humanity," it boomed, "you have awoken us. And now you will face the consequences." The gods were free, and the world would never be the same again. As the gods stepped into the open, The very earth beneath them trembled. Their enormous forms towered above, each one exuding an energy that seemed to warp the very fabric of reality. Alina and Armitage stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the creatures they had only heard about in ancient myths. Their faces were carved from stone, their eyes glowing with fierce, otherworldly fire. They were nothing like the benevolent protectors of old tales. These gods were warriors, angry and full of centuries-old rage. "Look at them," Armitage whispered, his voice full of awe and terror. "They're real." Alina could barely comprehend what was happening. She had known the prophecy, had studied the myths, but seeing these gods in the flesh was a different reality altogether. Their presence seemed to distort the air around them, like the world itself was bending in submission. The ground cracked and split, sending rocks tumbling down into the darkness below. The cavern was no longer just a place of discovery. It had become a war zone in the making. The first god, the largest of them all, stepped forward. His voice was like the clash of thunder, shaking the very bones of anyone who heard it. "We have been bound, forgotten by those we once protected. And now, the time has come for you to pay for your betrayal." Alina's heart pounded in her chest. She had always believed the myths, but this was no myth. These gods were not here to bless humanity. They were here to punish. The door that had once held them captive was now open, and there was no turning back. The gods began to move, their enormous limbs sweeping across the cavern. With every step, the ground beneath them cracked further, the sound echoing like an unstoppable force. Alina and Armitage backed away instinctively, but there was nowhere to run. The gods were everywhere, towering over them, filling the entire space with their presence. "You released us," the second god spoke, its voice cold as ice. "And now you shall feel the weight of our vengeance." Alina's mind raced. She had always known that there were ancient forces far beyond the scope of human understanding, but never had she imagined that humanity would be the one to wait them. What had started as an archaeological expedition had now become a fight for survival, a fight against beings who had the power to destroy worlds. "Can we stop them?" Armitage asked, his voice tense with fear. Alina shook her head, her eyes never leaving the gods. "I don't know," she whispered. "We need to warn the world. But first, we have to figure out what they want." The gods had no love for humanity. That much was clear. But why had they been awakened? What had driven these ancient beings to stay hidden for so long? As Alina and Armitage tried to make sense of the chaos around them, the gods seemed to be communicating with each other, their voices deep and unintelligible. But then, the largest god turned back to them, his eyes burning with an intense, fiery glow. "Humanity will face the consequences of its recklessness," he declared. "The world you know is about to fall. And you, Alina, will play a part in its destruction." Alina's heart skipped a beat. How did this god know her name? Was she part of the prophecy, or had they been watching her all along? It was too much to process. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in on her as the gods moved closer, their every step shaking the ground beneath her feet. In that moment, Alina realized something terrifying. There was no way to stop them. The gods had been sealed away for centuries, waiting for the right time to strike. And now, that time had come. "Get ready," Armitage said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to go. Now." But Alina didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, trying to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. These gods weren't just angry. They were seeking revenge for a betrayal that spanned millennia. And humanity was the one who had unleashed them. As she stood there, paralyzed with fear and disbelief, the gods moved again, their massive forms shifting with eerie fluidity. The ground cracked beneath them, and the very air seemed to bend under the weight of their power. Alina felt the intensity of their presence like a wave crashing over her, overwhelming her with its raw energy. The gods weren't interested in negotiating. They didn't care about humanity's pleas or apologies. They had one purpose: to punish the ones who had dared to seal them away. to make the world pay for its arrogance. And that punishment would come soon. Alina could feel it. There was no way to escape it. The gods had awoken, and the world was about to face their wrath. As the gods made their final approach, Alina and Armitage exchanged a glance. The fate of humanity now rested in their hands. The world was on the brink of destruction, and they were the only ones who could stop it, if they could figure out how. The fury of the gods had been unleashed. There was no going back. The world outside the cavern remained unaware of the cataclysm brewing beneath its surface. People went about their lives, oblivious to the ancient gods now stirring in the dark. But Alina and Armitage, trapped in the bowels of the earth, could feel the heavy weight of history upon their shoulders. The gods were not just vengeful beings. They were agents of destruction, and their awakening marked the beginning of something far worse than anyone could have ever imagined. As the gods slowly encircled Alina and Armitage, their towering figures casting long shadows over the duo, the air grew thick with energy. The gods' eyes were like fiery pits, glowing with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The ground under their feet trembled with every step the gods took, and the very walls of the cavern seemed to pulse with a strange, foreign rhythm, as if the universe itself was echoing their wrath. "You've awakened us," one of the gods spoke, his voice deep, like an earthquake rumbling in the distance. "You've set us free, but you have also condemned your kind. You will not survive the storm we bring." Alina's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had read about the gods in ancient texts, but this was nothing like what she had imagined. These beings weren't just ancient protectors. They were warriors, each one a symbol of nature's raw, untamed power. Their rage, cultivated over centuries, now threatened the very foundation of the galaxy. "Please," Alina said, her voice shaking, "we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't mean to." But the gods were beyond reason. Their judgment had already been passed. They had been sealed away for too long, waiting for the moment when humanity would be foolish enough to break the chains that bound them. Now that moment had come, and nothing would stop them from carrying out their wrath. The largest god, his form radiating heat like a supernova, looked down at them. His fiery eyes pierced through Alina and Armitage, as if seeing into the depths of their souls. "There is no excuse for your arrogance," he thundered. "You thought you could contain us, control us, but you were wrong. We are not your servants." The cavern shook violently as the god raised one massive arm. A wave of destructive energy radiated out from him, sending the air around them crackling with energy. Alina and Armitage had no time to react. The force was so strong that it sent them flying backwards, their bodies crashing into the jagged